History is written by the victors. Snow White secured her victory and dictated her story, but we will not repeat the sweet propaganda tale you think you know. We bring you a story written in blood, the blood of those who opposed Snow White and failed to grasp the truth until the very end. This is the true tale of a master manipulator whose divine beauty was so overwhelming that it bent reality itself, turning mirrors into willing slaves, hearts into puppets, and her own stepmother into the victim of the most brilliant frame-up in history. Chapter 1. The Mirror's First Lie. Young Snow White stood before her chamber mirror, studying her reflection with the cool calculation of an artist appraising her masterpiece. Her raven hair, short yet striking, framed her face with an effortless elegance. Her skin glowed with the pale luminescence of moonlight, and her lips held the deep red of fresh blood. But it was her eyes that truly captivated, not for their color, but for the raw power gleaming within them, power inherited from a source she had only recently discovered. Hidden in her chamber's secret drawer lay her real mother's diary, its pages yellowed with age. The former queen had died when Snow White was barely able to walk, but her legacy endured in those written words. The diary spoke of a peculiar legend, of women whose beauty was more than mere appearance. It was a force of nature, capable of bending reality itself. Such power could be cultivated through relentless discipline, honed into an art over years of mastery. Much of this knowledge had been lost, scattered through time. But Snow White's mother had dedicated her life to piecing it back together. She had spent her final years in pursuit of the ultimate secret, and yet she had failed. Like so many before her, she had lacked the resolve and insight necessary to unlock that power. But Snow White did not. "Mirror, mirror," Snow White whispered, trailing her fingers across the cool glass. "You see beauty as it truly is, don't you?" Her reflection smiled back, but something shifted beneath the glass like ripples across a pond. The diary had mentioned this, the first sign of awakening. The mirror shimmered, responding to her in a way no mirror had ever responded before. Snow White's mother had written of this moment, though she herself had never achieved it. The power required absolute beauty, not just physical perfection, but something beyond it. A beauty so complete that it became overwhelming. A beauty untainted by conscience or compassion. Snow White had spent years cultivating that perfection, and now, at last, the mirrors had begun to take notice. The surface fractured like ice under sunlight, yet instead of breaking, it reformed, becoming something more, something receptive. Snow White felt the connection forming, not just with this mirror, but with every reflective surface that had ever captured her image. Each one remembered her beauty, and through that memory, she could reach them, bend them, make them show others what she wanted them to see. A servant girl entered the chamber, carrying fresh linens. As she caught her own reflection in the mirror, she hesitated. Something was different. Though she saw only herself, her reflection seemed sharper, each feature slightly more vivid than usual, as if the mirror was revealing something she had never noticed before. "Martha," Snow White said, her voice velvet and honey, "you look tired. Come, sit with me." She patted the edge of her bed, watching as her power flowed through every reflective surface in the room, each one ready to show Martha exactly what Snow White wanted her to see in herself. Martha moved as if in a trance, her duties forgotten. "I shouldn't, Your Highness." "Nonsense, you work so hard. Tell me, what do they say about my stepmother in the servants' quarters?" "The Queen is beloved, Your Highness. She—" Martha's eyes grew distant as Snow White gently stroked her hand. The servant glanced at the mirror. Her reflected face showed worry and hesitation, a subtle shadow of uncertainty that had not been there before. "But surely you've noticed changes in yourself when around her." Snow White's voice carried concern, though her eyes remained sharp and focused. "Look in the mirror. See how your own face shows the strain of her recent instability." Martha frowned at her reflection. struggling to separate memory from what the mirror showed her. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper, her skin slightly paler, as if the weight of her interactions with the Queen had taken an invisible toll, one she had never noticed before. The mirror rippled, dark and restless, like water eager to pull her under. Now that you mention it, Snow White's smile deepened. Outside window, a cardinal perched on the sill, its red feathers bright against the stone. Snow White turned her gaze to it, and the bird froze, its small body stiffening under her unseen grip. In its black, beady eyes, twin reflections of Snow White shimmered, perfect, radiant, inescapable. "Little friend," she cooed, "would you sing for me?" The cardinal burst into song, but its melody carried an unnatural note, desperate, compulsive. Below, in the castle garden, other birds stopped their activities to listen. One by one they too began to sing, their voices joining the unnatural chorus. "Your Highness," Martha whispered, tears in her eyes though she couldn't say why. "You are so kind to worry about Her Majesty. Perhaps I should share your concerns with the other servants." Unable to look directly at Snow White, Martha found her gaze drawn instead to the image captured in the nearby mirror. Within the glass, her mistress's form seemed to flicker, revealing for just a moment to the poor girl a woman so beautiful she could deserve only trust and love. "Yes, Martha." Snow White's voice was a lullaby, wrapping around the girl like silk. "Share your concerns. After all, we all care for the Queen's well-being, don't we?" An hour later, Snow White stood before the Queen's legendary mirror, a towering artifact of ancient magic that loomed over the royal chamber. The Queen was attending a diplomatic dinner, and the princess had chosen her moment carefully. "Mirror, mirror on the wall," she spoke, her voice carrying a power that belied her young age. "Will you serve my beauty above all?" The mirror's surface swirled with mist and a face emerged, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, its features shifting like liquid silver. "Such beauty as yours commands even truth itself." It spoke in a voice like crystal chimes. "We mirrors live to reflect perfection, and we have found our true ruler." Snow White's laugh was like silver bells. "Then let us reshape what they see of themselves, dear mirror. When they think of her, of the Queen, show them their own decay. When they recall her words, let their reflections plant seeds of uncertainty. Show them how they react to a Queen who falters." The mirror quivered, its surface twisting in submission to her overwhelming beauty. Across the castle, in every looking glass, polished goblet, and still pool of water, the first distortions took hold. When servants checked their appearance while thinking of the Queen, whispered doubts surfaced in their minds, reinforced by their own troubled reflections. That night in her chamber, Snow White sat at her vanity, listening. The cardinal continued its compulsive song, drawing more and more birds into its desperate chorus. Some of them dropped dead, their bodies spent from singing a tune they did not understand. Snow White did not mind. Their song was beautiful. Every mirror she had passed earlier had yielded to her, an extension of her will, an amplifier of her power, a thread woven into her growing web of influence. "The power grows with use," she recalled from her mother's diary. "Each mirror seduced adds to the network, and each reflection controlled strengthens the whole. But beware, the price of such power is eternal perfection. One flaw, one crack in your beauty, and the mirrors may break free." Snow White gazed into the window glass. Her reflection promised a crown, and her smile held secrets dark as a moonless night. Eternal perfection. That wasn't a price, it was a promise. Let others fear age and decay. Her beauty would remain daunting and flawless, and through it she would reshape the very nature of truth itself. "Mirror, mirror," she whispered, "show them what they fear in themselves. Show them what they need to believe. This is just the beginning." Across the castle, the mirrors shivered in agreement, and somewhere in the grand halls, the Queen caught her own reflection. A shadow of unease passed over her features, fleeting yet undeniable. She did not yet understand why. She did not yet know that her stepdaughter's beauty had just corrupted every mirror in her castle. Chapter 2. The Hunter's Heart. Drawn to the mirror, the Queen leaned in, her trembling fingers tracing unfamiliar lines along her face. "Mirror, mirror," she whispered, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "Why do I look so tired?" The mirror's surface writhed, shifting like disturbed water. When the image settled, it showed her every flaw in cruel detail. Dark circles beneath her eyes, lines that had not been there before, a weight in her gaze that had once been sharp and commanding. Beyond the glass, whispers stirred through the castle. Servants exchanged uneasy glances, concerned about their queen's growing obsession with her reflection, her silence in council meetings, and her hesitation in decisions that once came easily. From the shadows, Snow White watched. Her crimson lips curled. The time had come for the next move in her game. In the castle's training yard, the royal huntsman maintained his crossbow with practiced ease. Eric had served the crown for 15 years. 15 years of loyalty, proven through 100 hunts and numerous battles. His oath to protect the royal family was sacred, unbreakable, until the moment Snow White approached him. "Master Huntsman," she called, and Eric's world tilted. He had seen the princess before, of course, but never this close, never alone. Her beauty struck him like a physical blow, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a warning bell chimed unheeded. "Your Highness." He bowed, unable to take his eyes from her face. "I've watched you practice," Snow White said, stepping closer. Something deep within him stirred, some primal instinct of devotion and awe. "They say you never miss your mark." Her voice carried admiration that made his chest swell with pride. "Tell me, what is it like to hold such power over life and death?" Eric had answered many questions in his life, orders from commanders, pleas from those he hunted, dying words from fallen men. But this was different. Snow White spoke not as royalty, not as a child of the court, but as something else entirely, someone who understood. They spoke of duty, of choices, of the weight of an oath and the burden of steel in one's hand. She listened, truly listened, her gaze intent, her touch light yet lingering when she laid a delicate hand upon his arm. And with every word, every glance, she wove her web tighter. "Sometimes," she whispered, her presence as effortless as the wind. "The truest loyalty requires difficult choices. The Queen, my stepmother, haven't you noticed the changes in her?" And he had noticed, hadn't he? The mirror in his quarters had shown him the truth, his own reflection bearing the silent proof of what he had tried to ignore. His shoulders had slumped, his eyes clouded with something beyond mere exhaustion. Whenever he thought of the Queen, something within him recoiled. Her paranoia, her erratic moods, her face pale and twisted with unknown fears. He almost felt pain looking at himself in the mirror, as his own reflection reminded him of his encounters with the Queen. "She plans to have me killed." Snow White's voice trembled, and Eric's breath caught as he saw unshed tears glistening in her lashes. "She sees me as a threat, though I've only ever tried to help her. She'll send someone soon, someone she trusts completely to take me into the woods." She cast a meaningful glance. "Someone who never misses his mark." Eric's world tilted. "Your Highness, When she gives the order..." Snow White pressed a hand to his chest, her touch burning through his leather armor. "Remember this moment. Remember what true loyalty means." As she pulled away, Eric still did not realize the snare had already snapped around his heart. The next day, when the Queen summoned Eric to her chambers, everything unfolded exactly as Snow White had foretold. The Queen, looking haggard and uncertain, stood before him, her regal composure unravelling thread by thread. Dark circles marred her once pristine features, and her hands trembled, though her voice remained steady. "There is no other way," she said, speaking more to herself than to him. "The corruption runs too deep. She is reshaping minds." Eric barely heard her. Snow White's presence lingered in his thoughts like a haunting perfume, clouding his reason and twisting doubt into something perilously close to certainty. For weeks the Queen had gathered evidence of Snow White's corruption, watching as her stepdaughter's beauty became a weapon, uncovering the network of enchanted mirrors, and discovering animals with lifeless gazes serving as spies. Each revelation felt like another crack in her heart. When she realized that Snow White was reshaping the minds of the entire court through their mirrors, the Queen understood she had failed as both a ruler and a mother. The order for Snow White's death was given in tears, but sealed with the conviction of a ruler who could no longer ignore the darkness growing within her walls. Unknown to her, word had long ago reached Snow White's ears, carried by her loyal rats. And as the Queen agonized over her decision, the princess simply smiled through it all. The forest path stretched before them, winding like a serpent through towering trees. Snow White rode side-saddle, the picture of innocence, her dark lashes lowered demurely, her green gown untouched by dust. The sunlight filtering through the canopy seemed drawn to her, caressing her skin in golden warmth. Eric led them deeper into the woods, his crossbow heavy on his back. The Queen's words pressed at the edges of his mind, but every mirror in the castle hinted at the Queen's unravelling mind, and servants whispered about her declining sanity. "It's time," Snow White said softly, dismounting with graceful ease. She turned to face him, her beauty more devastating than ever. "You know what you must do." Eric raised his crossbow, hands shaking. "The Queen ordered me to cut out my heart," Snow White finished, stepping closer until the crossbow's tip touched her chest. "But you won't. You'll take the heart of a deer instead. You'll tell her you've completed your task, and you'll live with the knowledge that you chose true loyalty over blind obedience." The forest stilled. The birds fell silent. The air held no breath of wind. The world itself seemed to wait. Eric stared into Snow White's eyes and saw not fear, but triumph. His hands trembled. He was the Queen's huntsman. He had sworn an oath, and yet, "I can't—" The words caught in his throat. "You already have," she whispered, and he blinked, realizing the crossbow was now pointed at the ground. "Look." A young deer stepped into the clearing, its eyes glazed and vacant. It moved with jerky steps, controlled by Snow White's hypnotic beauty. Eric watched in horror and fascination as the creature lay down before them, docile and unafraid, offering itself. "Quick now," Snow White commanded. "Make it clean." The crossbow fired before Eric realized he'd pulled the trigger. The deer fell, blood darkening the earth, and Snow White's smile was colder than midwinter. "Good man," she praised as he mechanically harvested the heart. "You've proven your true loyalty today. Now return to the castle. Tell them how I begged for mercy, how you couldn't bear to watch my death. Show them this heart as proof, and let them believe that I am truly gone." Eric nodded, tears streaming down his face. The heart's warmth seeped through his fingers, each beat a reminder of his betrayal. Somewhere in his mind, Eric knew he had just helped set something dreadful in motion. "Oh, and Eric." He glanced back. Snow White stood at the forest's edge, dark hair drifting in the breeze. Something unreadable flickered in her expression. "Thank you for the escort to the Dwarf lands. Their mountain fortresses are so hard to reach without a proper guide. So many wild beasts and bandits." Eric's blood ran cold. His gaze snapped to the path they had travelled. Not just any trail. The main trade route to the Dwarf kingdoms. He had not only failed in his mission, he had helped Snow White reach her true destination. Eric mounted his horse and rode for the castle, the forest closing behind him like a mouth swallowing a secret. In every puddle and stream his reflection followed, but it was not the face of a loyal Queen's huntsman. It was the face of a man who had betrayed everything he had once believed in. In the distance, Snow White's laughter echoed like silver bells, a haunting melody that resonated through the forest. The pieces were in place. The dwarven lords awaited her, though they didn't know it yet. Chapter 3. The 7 Lords of the Mountain. Lord Grimm, eldest of the 7 dwarf lords, paused before a polished shield in the Mountain Keep's great hall. His reflection troubled him. Though it was his own face that stared back, he swore he saw weakness lurking beneath the surface, whispering doubts of shared power. The shield, a recent gift from the mysterious lady who had arrived at their borders mere weeks ago, was just one of many reflective surfaces that had begun appearing throughout the dwarven fortress. Snow White sat in her carefully chosen chambers, positioned precisely where the morning sun would illuminate her beauty to devastating effect. The mountain fortress had proven an ideal stage for her performance, its very architecture working to her advantage. Every polished surface, every decorated shield, every mirror in the 7 lords' private chambers now served as her tools, bent to her will to show each lord exactly what she wished them to see in their own reflections. The lords came to her throughout the day, each believing that they alone held this special privilege. For each, she crafted a unique performance. For Lord Grimm, she became a delicate flower needing protection. For Lord Steelhand, a warrior queen worthy of his strength. To Lord Ironheart, she was justice incarnate. To Lord Goldmane, glory personified. For Lord Blackaxe, she embodied martial prowess, while Lord Frostbeard saw territorial ambition made flesh. Lord Stonecrown, ever prideful, encountered ancient nobility that matched his own. To each she whispered of threats and opportunities, of rivals and alliances. Their reflections reinforced her every word, standing taller when pledging fealty, revealing hesitation when thinking of their fellow lords. Each left her presence convinced of their unique importance to her grand design, blind to the fact that their own mirrors had long since been turned against them. Between audiences, she visited the fortress kitchens, where woodland creatures worked with mindless devotion. Rats turned spits, birds sorted grains, and deer hauled burdens far beyond their strength. The dwarven servants watched in awe, whispering of her magical connection to nature. Their reflections in polished pots and gleaming steel showed them ever more devoted to her, ever more uneasy when recalling their old loyalties. What they didn't see were the frozen eyes of the animals, the way they worked until they dropped from exhaustion, the way they neglected their own young to serve her will. A fox collapsed after working 3 days straight, and Snow White simply summoned another to take its place, the new creature's gaze already hollow under her control. In her chambers that evening, Snow White stood before her mirror, watching the intricate web of her manipulation take shape. A lesser strategist might have united the lords openly, but she knew better. Divided loyalty was stronger than unified allegiance. Each lord, pushing to outshine his rivals, would forge stronger armies than any cooperative effort. More importantly, 7 competing forces meant 7 chances for victory, with no single lord powerful enough to turn against her. The mirrors in their chambers reinforced these divisions perfectly, each showing its owner exactly what would inflame their devotion to her cause and their distrust of others. When they thought of her, they saw themselves as heroes. When they thought of each other, their reflections showed contempt and rivalry. As night fell, 7 generals from 7 armies came to her separately, each reporting their lord's secret preparations for war. Snow White received them with perfectly calibrated responses, a gasp of surprise for one, a knowing smile for another, a tear of gratitude for a third. Each general left seeing their own reflection standing prouder, more confident in their service to her cause, the mirror spell deepening with every interaction. Later, as moonlight filtered through the mountain crystals, Snow White stepped onto her balcony, surveying the dwarf kingdom below. Torches flickered in the darkness, marking the restless movement of troops. The fortress animals toiled ceaselessly, preparing supplies for an army whose true size none of the lords yet understood. Snow White's laughter rang through the halls, silver and sweet, winding through the mountain like a whispered prophecy. Below, the forest creatures shuddered at the sound of her mirth, but they could not stop their labours. The spell of her beauty held them as surely as a spider's web ensnares its prey, and they worked on, doomed in their misery, mere tools in her grand design. In their chambers, 7 lords dreamed of her, each believing himself to be her chosen one. Their mirrors showed them exactly what they needed to see in their own reflections: heroism, nobility, destiny, while her dominion over every reflective surface grew stronger by the hour. She became aware that she no longer needed to look into a certain mirror to become its mistress. Her control over the castle's reflective surfaces had broken free and unleashed itself upon the city and beyond. Her powers ran like fire through a dry forest, taking control of increasingly vast territories. The phenomenon had an epidemic quality to it. It seemed that anyone who looked into an already infected object could spread the infection to other reflective surfaces. Snow White no longer needed to do the job herself, one by one. The reflection-altering web spread itself without any encouragement on her part, and spread very fast. War was coming, and Snow White had ensured that, no matter the victor, the crown would be hers. The price would be paid in dwarf blood and broken oaths, in shattered alliances and hollowed-out souls, a price she had long accepted. Victory was no longer a question. It was inevitability. Chapter 4. Siege of Twisted Truths. Dawn broke over the Queen's castle, its golden light catching on thousands of dwarf-forged helmets encircling the fortress. 7 armies had marched through the night, each believing itself the first to arrive, each lord convinced he alone was chosen to seize victory for their princess. Within an hour, the northern and eastern gates had fallen. The city, once a bastion of the Queen's rule, had become a battlefield of flickering torches and shadowy figures pressing ever closer to her final sanctuary. Inside the highest chamber, the Queen stood at her window, hands trembling as she watched the overwhelming force below. The banners of 7 lords snapped in the cold wind, a grotesque parade of loyalty twisted into submission. When she turned away, her reflection in the glass caught her eye, worn, haggard, her doubts carved into every line of her face. The mirror magic had worked its way through the castle, through the very city itself. The grand mirror at the heart of her chamber pulsed with a dark glow, enslaved long ago by Snow White's beauty, reinforcing the weight of her fears. A sudden movement outside, ravens, dark and swift, sliced through the air with impossible precision, their wings aligning in eerie geometric patterns. Below, rats scurried in unison through the alleyways, guiding the dwarf forces along hidden passages. The city itself was no longer hers. "My queen!" A guard burst into the chamber, breathless. "Our people! They're turning against us!" Beyond the castle walls, the citizens joyfully greeted the dwarf army, laughing and singing. In the middle of chaos, they had spontaneously begun a celebration. The mirrors in their homes had done their work well, distorting, exaggerating, whispering subtle lies at their convictions. When people looked at their reflections while thinking of the Queen, they felt like accomplices to a terrible crime, filled with regret. When they thought of Snow White, the mirrors filled them with the warm anticipation of a future shaped by a divine saviour. The outer walls were barely holding. The Queen's loyal army faltered, their hands gripping swords grown impossibly heavy. In every shield and polished blade, they saw their own faces lined with exhaustion, as if their very souls had aged from loyalty alone. On the battlefield, Lord Grimm led his battalion toward the castle's main gate, only to find Lord Steelhand's forces already in position. Their eyes met across the battlefield, mutual distaste quickly turning into bloodthirsty hatred. Long ago, mirrors had convinced each of them that they were destined to be the first in Snow White's grand plans. Now, the fractured reflections in broken glass and scattered shields only deepened their delusions of grandeur. Two of them could not share one victory. "Stand down, Steel Hand!" Grimm's voice boomed across the courtyard. "The princess entrusted me to lead this assault." "Impossible!" Steel Hand roared, raising his warhammer. "She swore it was I who would deliver her vengeance." The argument might have escalated into bloodshed had a single voice not cut through the din like a crystal blade. "My lords!" Snow White stood atop the outer wall, smuggled in by her loyal citizens, the rising sun framing her in golden radiance. The battlefield stilled, and war-hardened lords forgot to breathe. "Behold!" She extended her arms with graceful authority. "Each of you has come to my aid, united in purpose if not in knowledge. Why quarrel among yourselves when my stepmother's castle lies before us?" The lords hesitated. They looked at her, then at each other, their anger at being manipulated drowned in the overwhelming pull of her presence. In their confusion, they failed to notice how their troops moved with unnatural grace, guided by the same silent force that had bound the forest creatures in mindless servitude. The siege, when it came, was unlike any in history. 7 dwarf legions launched their assault with uncanny coordination, their troops moving like chess pieces under hidden influence. War machines crafted in 7 different forges struck in unison, launching their payloads simultaneously, while birds and beasts moved in surreal harmony alongside the soldiers. The castle defenders faltered, beset not by steel alone, but by the insidious whisper of their own reflections. Every polished surface betrayed them. Shields, windows, even the water in their drinking cups showed them their faces filled with fear, wavering and signs of despair whenever they thought of the Queen's protection. "Hold the gates!" the Queen commanded, but her voice cracked with the uncertainty the castle mirrors had forced on her through all these months. "Allow them in!" countered Snow White's voice, silken and irresistible. "End this peacefully. Save yourselves. You don't even believe in your cause or in yourselves. If you don't trust me, look at the mirrors around you. Your own reflection will tell you the truth." The castle guards looked into their polished shields. Their reflections hinted at either defeat and death if they resisted, or strength and prosperity if they surrendered. One by one, the defenders' weapons fell, overcome by the visions reflected back at them. At that moment, Lord Frostbeard's sappers breached the eastern wall with thunderous precision, while Lord Blackaxe's troops scaled the western battlements. From within, citizens, long corrupted by their mirrors, threw open the gates, allowing Lord Stonecrown's forces to flood the courtyard. The Queen's remaining loyal guards fought desperately in the chaos, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers. The sound of dwarf war chants echoed off the ancient stones, punctuated by the crash of siege engines and the unnatural chorus of Snow White's enslaved bird army, drowning out the desperate shouts of the defenders as they struggled against the tide of betrayal from their own people. Snow White glided through the chaos, untouched and immaculate, her dress somehow remaining pristine despite the blood and dirt spraying around her. Woodland creatures darted through the battle at her command, rats tripping guards with coordinated movements, birds blinding archers with precision strikes, and deer charging in formation alongside the dwarf infantry, each animal operating with puppet-like precision. From her tower, the Queen watched her kingdom fall, her heart sinking with each passing moment. The mirror behind her bared not just her own reflection, but every failure and hidden flaw, until she could no longer tell which memories were real and which were planted by her reflection's subtle manipulations. Snow White ascended the tower steps with regal grace, her 7 dwarf lords trailing her like bewitched shadows, each believing himself her sole favourite. In every polished surface they passed, each saw a reflection of himself as her right hand, blissfully unaware that his rivals saw the same false promise mirrored back at them. As she reached the threshold of the Queen's chamber, Snow White paused to admire her reflection in a blood-splattered shield. flawless, not a hair out of place. A raven landed on her shoulder, its empty eyes mirroring the soulless perfection of her smile. Mirror. Mirror on the wall. She spoke clearly, her voice resonating with power. Who is fairest of them all? The great mirror responded. Even though it was hung behind a thick wall, far from Snow White's direct gaze, it still felt its true mistress's command. The queen's breath caught as she watched the surface ripple and boil, shifting like molten silver. The mirror had never behaved this way before. Never had it acted without her will, or at least not in front of her. She had assumed its loyalty. She had believed that, even if the castle fell, even if all the lesser mirrors succumbed, the great mirror would remain hers. But she had been living in delusion. The mirror had been enslaved long ago. And now, it acted not under the direct influence of Snow White's beauty, not because she stood before it, commanding it, but because it remembered her. It did not need her presence, only the memory of it. Unbelievable. The queen's pulse pounded. She had to stop this. She lunged for the heavy candelabrum in front of the mirror itself. But before her fingers could close around it, an invisible force seized her hand. The mirror would not let her touch it. Her breath hitched as her fingers locked midair, muscles spasming as if she had gripped red-hot iron. Still, she fought. With all her will, she pushed forward, straining to grasp the candelabrum, until the pressure on her fingers snapped. A sickening crack. A sharp burst of pain. She had no time to cry out before the invisible force hurled her across the room. She hit the marble floor hard, the impact rattling through her bones, her vision flashing white with agony. As she struggled to rise, clutching her ruined hand, she forced herself to regain some dignity. Meanwhile, across the kingdom, the mirrors responded. In every home and shop, in every noble's looking-glass and soldier's shield, reflections shifted. When people thought of Snow White, their faces brightened with admiration, their backs straightened, their images glowed with righteous strength. When they thought of the queen, hesitation, weakness, decay. The final blow had been struck. The doors opened. Snow White stepped inside without knocking. The queen met Snow White's gaze, the monster finally unmasked. She had always sensed the rotten creature lurking behind that beautiful facade, which was why she had ordered the huntsman to end Snow White's life quietly in the forest. Yet now the queen fully realized how terribly she had underestimated her. If she had understood Snow White better, she would have acted with more conviction, sending not just one man to carry out the deed, but an entire army. But it was too late now. Far too late. "The castle is yours," she whispered, her voice ancient with defeat. "It was always going to be yours, wasn't it?" Snow White's smile glinted sharp, as beautiful as it was wicked, a cold triumph sparkling in her eyes. "Everything is mine," she corrected softly. "The mirrors, the hearts, the very beasts of the forest and sky. It always was. You just didn't see it in time. You twisted everything. Every reflection, every soul in in this God-forsaken kingdom." "I didn't." Snow White's voice rang with crystalline clarity. "I simply showed people what they wanted to see. You never understood that power, did you? That's why you relied on hunters and other primitive tools." She gestured to her own reflection in the grand mirror, perfect and radiant. "Beauty isn't just about appearance. It's about making others see themselves as you want them to." Behind her, 7 dwarf lords raised their weapons, their eyes glazed with adoration, murmuring words of agreement like a practiced choir. Even drenched in grief, the queen found strength to save herself. While the lords were lost in their reverent praise, she fled into the labyrinth of the ancient castle she had once considered her only home. Soon it would turn into a hunting ground. Snow White made no move to pursue. She would find her, eventually. The sky was already blackened by her bird army, and the halls crawled with her rats and snakes. her eyes and ears. There would be no place to hide. As dawn overtook the kingdom, Snow White stood at her new window. Below, the citizens celebrated their liberation, their reflections having taught them to see freedom in chains. The dwarf armies made camp outside the city walls, their lords still competing for her favor, unaware of their own manipulation, each seeing only glory in every reflective surface they passed. In the mirror's reflection, Snow White wore her crown with perfect, practiced ease. It had always belonged there, after all. A cardinal with dead eyes landed on her windowsill and began to sing her victory song, its melody as cold and sweet as the new queen herself. Chapter 5. The Apple's Bitter Taste. The former queen clutched her last possession, a splendid red apple from the royal orchards she had once tended with such care. She caught her reflection in a puddle and recoiled. A bent crone stared back at her, aged beyond her years. Had she always been this broken, or was that yet another carefully constructed lie? She couldn't tell any more. Through the network of enchanted mirrors, Snow White watched her stepmother's suffering with quiet amusement. Every puddle and pain not only tortured this miserable woman with exaggerated details of ugliness and devastation, but also evoked fragments of memories she couldn't trust, distorted visions that stripped away what little resolve remained. A sense of deep satisfaction washed over Snow White. The throne was hers, but there were still things to do. The time for dealing with the rest will come soon. As if summoned by her thoughts, Lord Grimm entered the royal chamber, his presence a stark contrast to the despair of the former queen she had just witnessed. "My queen," he began, and his eyes were immediately drawn to a nearby mirror. It reflected him as he wished to be seen, mighty, victorious, an unshakable pillar of Snow White's reign. The procession awaits. In a moment, Snow White did not turn, admiring her own reflection. The morning light kissed her profile, perfect as ever. And what of the other preparations? The city guards have been positioned as you commanded. Though Lord Steelhand insists his troops would be better suited, all the lords will play their parts, Snow White assured him, placing a hand lightly on his arm. His breath caught. He glanced at his reflection again, seeing himself as her chosen protector, the mirror's magic reinforcing his devotion. The royal procession wound through the city streets, a spectacle of triumph. Each mirror and every reflective surface they passed was under Snow White's spell, ready to show citizens exactly what she wanted them to see. She had chosen her route carefully, knowing precisely where her stepmother would be waiting. Lining the streets, the people caught glimpses of themselves in the windows and polished shields. Their reflections radiated confidence, pride, and devotion, all enhanced by thoughts of their new queen. In the shadows of an alley, the former queen clutched the apple tighter. Every reflective surface around her gnawed at her mind, and blinding madness loomed just next door. Only one desire, one thought kept her from cracking completely. She had to try one last time to reach the girl she had raised. This should work. It could not fail. It must not. The royal carriage approached the predetermined spot. The former queen stepped forward, her frail form reflected in a shop window. The glass twisted her image, magnifying every weakness, every failure. "My child," the old woman called, her voice cracking. "Please, may we speak? I bring a peace offering." She held up the apple, its skin as red as blood, as red as Snow White's lips. The carriage came to a halt. Snow White emerged like a vision, her beauty so overwhelming that every reflective surface in the square fell instantly under her spell. The crowd saw themselves not as individuals, but as a single faceless mass of adoring subjects. Their devotion was absolute. She approached her stepmother with practiced grace, the weight of her presence intimidating the overthrown ruler. "How kind," her voice rang through the square, smooth as silk. "After everything, you still think of reconciliation?" The former queen held out the apple with trembling hands. A puddle at her feet showed her reflection twisted with despair. "I was wrong about so many things," she whispered. "But I loved you. I still do." For an instant, something flickered in Snow White's eyes, perhaps a distant memory of a woman who once tried to be her mother. But it vanished like frost under a rising sun. Snow White accepted the apple with a graceful hand. "Of course you do," she said softly for her stepmother's ears alone, savouring the moment. "That's what makes this so perfect." Before the old woman could react, Snow White bit into the apple with deliberate grace. Gasps filled the square as the young mistress staggered, clutching her throat with desperate elegance. In every reflection throughout the square, those who found the will to look away from the terrible scene saw themselves looking horrified, noble in their concern for Snow White's well-being. "Poison!" Lord Grimm bellowed, drawing his sword. "The Mad Queen tries to murder her daughter again!" Reflections across the square echoed the chaos, showing every citizen as a righteous defender. As Snow White collapsed gracefully into Lord Steelhand's arms, her performance flawless despite the apple's juice still sweet on her tongue, Lord Frostbeard's voice cut through the uproar. "Seize her!" "No!" the old queen cried, retreating in dawning horror. "It was only an apple! A peace offering!" But the mirrors had already rewritten the story, transforming the crowd into divine crusaders against forces of hell. In shop windows and polished armor, their faces glowed with an almost luminous conviction that screamed their brutal intent. "Don't let her escape!" Snow White gasped, her voice a masterpiece of agony. "She mustn't escape again!" The crowd surged forward, fueled by the echoes of their reflections, each step a drumbeat of righteous fury. The former queen stumbled back, her heart racing as she faced the wrath of those she once ruled. Desperation clawed at her throat as she sought a way to escape the tightening noose of judgment. "Help me!" she cried, her voice trembling. But the crowd was deaf to her pleas, their eyes wild with fervour. Only by a mere miracle did the overthrown queen manage to flee the city walls, pursued by dwarves, enchanted beasts, and her own former subjects alike. Every reflective surface along her path twisted her image into a disgusting monstrosity, while her hunters saw themselves as God-blessed avengers. At last, the chase ended at a cliff. Cornered against the sheer rock wall, the former queen stood tall one last time. A tiny puddle of rainwater showed her reflection, but for the first time in months, she refused to look at it, denying Snow White this final victory over her self-image. "I see you now," she called out to the armies arrayed before her, her voice carrying a clarity it had not possessed in months. "I see what you truly are, what I helped create, and I'm sorry, not for today, but for not seeing it sooner." Lord Blackaxe gave the command, and the dwarf artillery opened fire with devastating precision. Burying the former queen in a tomb of rock and dust. Later that evening, Snow White stood once more before her great mirror. The apple was gone, the performance perfected. Throughout the land, reflections of her people confirmed her version of the tale. She touched her lips where the apple's sweetness had vanished without a trace. "A peace offering," she murmured. "Thank you, Mother. How fitting." In the mountain pass, as night claimed the sky, beasts and birds moved in silent unity, cleansing the earth and scavenging the remnants of the old queen, ensuring the past would remain forgotten, whatever small chance it had for return. Chapter 6. The Empire of Corrupted Glass. The coronation ceremony was a masterpiece of manipulation. Snow White had positioned mirrors strategically throughout the great hall, each reflecting the viewers in unique ways, subtly shifting their moods and thoughts. Common folk saw themselves standing taller, their faces brightened as they pledged loyalty to her. Nobles felt a surge of purpose and pride in supporting her claim. The dwarf lords envisioned themselves as legendary heroes in every reflective surface, each image reinforcing their devotion. Above, birds flew in elegant geometric patterns, their wings beating in unison under her control. Mice and rats lined the halls in precise rows, while deer and wolves stood guard at regular intervals, their eyes as cold as their mistress's heart, all bound to her unwavering command. As the crown was placed upon her head, Snow White shed a single shining tear, a calculated gesture of perfection. "I accept this crown," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner, "not for power, but for duty, not for glory, but for justice." The crowds cheered with orchestrated enthusiasm. Her first command as queen, spoken to her closest allies, was simple yet profound. Every home must have a mirror. Every public space, every shop, every barn. Call it a celebration of my coronation, a generous gift from your new queen. It was just the first step. The second hit much harder. Throughout the kingdom, citizens were required to wear what she called everywhere mirrors, small reflective plates fixed to their wrists like bracelets. Those who refused were reported by their neighbours, whose own reflections showed them prouder and more devoted when serving their queen. The reported were taken to special places lined with mirrors, forced to watch their own reflections twist and bend until their minds broke under the assault. With the kingdom firmly under her control, Snow White's empire grew through a series of calculated marriages and convenient deaths. King Aldrich of the Eastern Realms was the first. It began when the citizens of his kingdom started thinking about the neighbouring queen in increasingly favourable ways. Initially they were confused. Disturbing stories had circulated from merchants, pilgrims, and travellers about Snow White. Tales of her obsession with her own beauty, unsettling rumours about the dark powers she controlled, and the unnatural way animals reacted to her presence. Whispers spoke of the mysterious disappearance of the old queen, and how even her memory had been erased from the minds of those under Snow White's rule. Some accounts described Snow White as a tyrant, ruling her land with an iron fist through blood and terror. She stripped away freedoms, leaving her subjects with nothing but fear. Those who dared to question her rule vanished in the night, only to return as unrecognizably obedient individuals, wholly aligned with her will. But then, something shifted. These dark rumours and fears dissipated like morning mist. The more the people of the Eastern Realms gazed into their mirrors, the more they began to see Snow White differently. They no longer thought of her as a ruthless queen. Instead, they imagined her as a beautiful, kind, and tragic figure, deserving of admiration. How could anyone ever believe such malicious lies about her? Snow White was a pitiable but radiant queen who had endured immense sorrow. She had lost both her beloved mother and stepmother, tragedies that marked the beginning of her suffering. Poor, young, beautiful Snow White. She needed support and protection. Why couldn't their own King Aldrich see that? A union with such an angelic figure would benefit everyone. Aldrich would gain a beautiful wife after the tragic disappearance of his previous queen, whose name few even remembered. The Eastern Realms would prosper, becoming richer and more secure with this alliance. Snow White's subjects, too, would flourish under Aldrich's strong army, which would shield her fragile lands from marauding dwarf bandits and aggressive neighbours. Whispers of Snow White's virtues reached Aldrich's ears. Some came from his own subjects, while others seemed to echo in his mind as he studied his reflection in his mirrors. Everything that followed moved swiftly. Their first meetings, falling in love, and within weeks, the grand celebration of their marriage. Citizens of both kingdoms rejoiced, believing they had chosen her as their queen, that this was the natural order of things, and then tragedy. King Aldrich was found dead, bitten by a venomous snake in the royal gardens. Snow White mourned briefly but did not wear her widow's veil for long. Citizens of neighbouring kingdoms whispered about the countless advantages of marrying such a beautiful, fragile and defenceless young woman. The rulers of the Southern Isles and the Northern Territories soon followed the same pattern. Each marriage ended in sudden tragedy, with Snow White's flawless grief earning the sympathy of all. Through it all, the mirrors reinforced a growing sense of confidence and joy among her new subjects, ensuring their acceptance of their widowed queen. She wore black for exactly 7 days after each loss. Her mourning was as impeccable as her beauty. The absorption of new territories was seamless. Her armies, led by 7 devoted dwarf lords, moved with unwavering loyalty. Each dwarf lord believed himself to be her favoured general, enchanted by her private praises and promises. None realized they were all offered the same affectionate lies. The mirror network grew more sophisticated with each passing month. Kings and queens of distant lands began to seal their mirrors and ban reflective surfaces from their courts, but it was too late. Snow White's influence had already spread through trade routes and diplomatic channels. Each new mirror that reflected her beauty became another window for her to reshape reality. Her allure remained devastating and precise, a power that shattered the resolve of anyone who dared to meet her gaze. One night, as her empire slumbered, Snow White stood before the great mirror, her web of control pulsing with dark energy. "Mirror, mirror," she whispered to her network of enslaved glass and metal. "Show them what I want them to see in themselves." A sudden crash pierced the silence as a servant girl dropped a goblet Snow White had ordered a while ago. Before the echo of the shattering glass faded, dwarf guards seized her with mechanical precision. "Please, my queen," the girl cried out, trembling in their grip. "It was an accident. I meant no—" "Of course it was an accident. Martha, isn't it?" Snow White's voice was gentle, her beauty striking in its calculated intensity. Martha fell to her knees, weeping, afraid to meet her mistress's gaze. She knew what would happen next, and she was not mistaken. "But we must maintain standards, mustn't we?" Snow White continued in the same soft voice, then added, "Take her to the Reshaper." The girl's screams echoed through the castle as she was dragged to underground chambers filled with mirrors, where her will would be stripped away. When she emerged, her gaze would be as blank as the animal's eyes that served their queen. Her very reflection transformed into something as inhuman as her new purpose. Snow White swiftly dismissed the girl and her name from her memories, and refocused on her own reflection, unchanged by time or conscience. Throughout her empire, every mirror awaited her command, ready to shape each person's thoughts and very souls according to her design. Yet her power came with a price. The beauty that allowed her to control what others saw in their mirrors demanded her own perfection. One flaw, one sign of aging, and her hold over the mirrors might weaken or even break entirely. Who could predict what the mirrors might do to her and her empire if they were freed from her grasp, fully aware of how they had been used? She knew these possibilities and feared them. There was nothing more fleeting in this world than a woman's beauty. But Snow White had a plan to prevent her inevitable decay, as she called it. The plan was already in motion. Engineers of her empire had received the designs and were preparing to remodel her castle. It would become a crystalline mountain, filled with mirrors and devoid of non-reflective surfaces inside. In this way, her beauty would be trapped at its peak, endlessly reflected and emanating back at her in a constant, eternal loop. Immortality under a crystal dome, or a sarcophagus, as she sometimes thought of it. As her power grew and the empire amassed more resources, the sarcophagus would expand, consuming more and more territories beyond her castle. Snow White never intended to be confined to one place in her existence. She longed to roam the lands she ruled, freely and without restraint. But first, she needed to transform those lands to ensure her beauty would never fade. She had never imagined achieving something like this when she first began manipulating mirrors. Yet it seemed that she was indeed a gifted girl. So gifted, in fact, that with enough devotion, she could achieve almost anything. As moonlight illuminated her striking features, Snow White understood the true nature of her power. She wasn't just a queen who controlled mirrors. She had become the mirror itself, an instrument of eternal, unchanging perfection, reflecting back at humanity whatever she wished them to see in their deepest desires and darkest fears. The animals that served her, the people who worshipped her, the dwarf lords who fought for her favor, they were all mere distortions of her will, reflections of reality bent to her purpose. The mirrors no longer just obeyed her, they enveloped her. The more she shaped them, the more they shaped her. She transcended mere beauty, becoming something else entirely. She was no longer a woman, nor a queen. She was the reflection within the mirror, a presence that could never fade, a force that reshaped truth itself. As she stood there, beautiful and terrible in her triumph, the last flicker of humanity in her gaze vanished, leaving only the cold, perfect emptiness of polished glass. And so, dear viewers, when you next look into a mirror, take a moment to study your reflection closely. Does your face change when you think of certain people or evoke specific memories? Do you feel stronger with some thoughts and weaker with others? For Snow White's tale teaches us that our reflection can be the most dangerous mirror of all, showing us not who we truly are, but who others want us to believe we should be.